Hello folks, thanks for joining our live event about forensic email collectors, upcoming OneDrive and SharePoint support. If you watched our last live event along these lines, it was about direct drive acquisitions in forensic email collector. And since then we have released two major features. One of them was Drive Explorer, which allowed us to essentially explore what's in Google Drive and cherry pick specific items to acquire, perhaps filter drive and see metadata there and export metadata from there. And the other one is app-only authentication for Microsoft, and that allowed us to essentially replace impersonation and exchange, and instead of impersonation use application credentials rather than user credentials to essentially acquire different data points from anywhere in an organization, or perhaps put some limits on what could be accessible to the application and acquire from a subset of whatever is in the organization in terms of mailboxes or user accounts. So today I'm happy to announce a couple of new features that have been in the works for a while and frequently requested features, mainly OneDrive and SharePoint acquisitions. I'll walk you through what's new, and you'll see that we will cover some of the Drive Explorer and app-only authentication stuff because it's also applicable here, and you'll see why we had to put those pieces in place so that this could become reality. So I'll start by sharing my screen so you see what we have in the works. All right, so forensic email collector, this is essentially a testing build, not the currently published public version, so don't be surprised if you see some stuff here that's not available right now, but this is the user interface remains largely the same. So the OneDrive and SharePoint stuff is going to be applicable in three different scenarios right now. One of them is when we're targeting personal Microsoft accounts, like somebody's Outlook.com account or Hotmail account or something along those lines, and they have OneDrive data, the acquisition of that, or acquiring the OneDrive data and SharePoint data that's accessible to a Microsoft 365 user. So I say accessible because it doesn't necessarily have to be that user's OneDrive or SharePoint site. It could be anything that's in the organization where they belong and they have been given permission to access. And finally, we will cover how you can use app-only credentials to access essentially just about anything in the organization, including tons of SharePoint sites and OneDrives and stuff like that, which is quite exciting because you could do like a wholesale acquisition from an organization in terms of SharePoint and OneDrive. So I'll start small and start with the individual Microsoft personal OneDrive stuff, and then we can proceed from there. So let's say we have an account like our test account here. See that with Outlook.com. We can log in. Now you'll see that we have an additional option here that says include direct OneDrive, and there's some help description there. So I'll choose that here and exclude the other one. And skip over the case details. Pick a path for output here. You'll see, because I didn't choose the email stuff, we have fewer options here, but there's still an option to containerize direct drive in this case. So I'll log in. This part could be direct authentication or coming from remote authenticator token or something like that. I'll choose one of the accounts I have here. And when you log in, you'll see essentially a list of OneDrives here. Very similar to what we did when we implemented direct Google Drive support. In that case, we were seeing all the Google Drives and the shared team drives that the user was a member of. In this case, we're seeing the OneDrives. These couple of guys here are system OneDrives, and we do have descriptions where applicable, so you can see what that is about. In this case, there's not much to see in these guys, so we can exclude them. And then we have the usual options as far as in-place search and exploring goes. So let's take a look at both of those here. First, I'll take a look at in-place search. So this looks very similar to what we have been doing for email in-place searches. So we can search for something like incident or guidance, for example, just quick example. So it'll run a quick search, similar to email stuff. It's just going to ping the server, get the search results. So we're not really acquiring anything yet, just getting some metadata. You'll see that we have some specific icons for the different types of files that there are. You can just preview your search and save and acquire. So nothing new here in terms of technology goes. Similar in-place search concept, but this time applied to OneDrive and SharePoint. But the search mechanics and syntax are going to be quite a bit different than what you are used to from Exchange Web Services searches or even Graph API email searches. So we will have some syntax happen, some examples perhaps to cover that, but the idea is generally the same. The other thing that's applicable here is the exploring of drives. So we can hit this button. If you see, we'll do a mini acquisition there, metadata acquisition, to get you this metadata stuff ready to go. If you haven't used FEC in a while, or if you didn't check out the recent changes, this Drive Explorer stuff is relatively new. Essentially, this is a way to mount a Google Drive, or in this case OneDrive or SharePoint, to see what's inside with metadata, with a flexible grid where you can run some searches and filtering really quickly, and you can see the folder structure right away and filter on folder as well. So if you wanted to, for example, specifically narrow down to a certain folder, you can right click and say explore from here. It'll just narrow things down to just that folder, and you can explore what's in there and perhaps acquire a few items from there if you like. Or you could use this grid. Let's fit these columns here. You can use the grid to see metadata about these items, including sizes, dates, and more importantly, paths. Even at this early stage before we acquire, we are able to construct these folder paths for these items. Same thing with Google Drive. So that allows you to see what's in the drive, even filter by certain keywords if you want on the path, or you could create like a more complex, perhaps Boolean search around multiple metadata fields and narrow things down. So there's a lot of flexibility in terms of sorting, searching, and different types of searches regarding what a file name begins with or ends with, contains, or whatever you like. But the general idea here is to see what's in there and perhaps cherry pick a few items and explore and acquire if you wanted to. Now, something that you could do here is a combination of the two, where I showed you this for, I think, Google Drive as well. In some scenarios, you may want to combine both approaches. For example, let's say you have a large organization, tons of SharePoint sites or OneDrives, and maybe you want to run a search first based on content, right? And narrow things down and see what's there, and then maybe cherry pick from there. So you could combine the two along those lines. You could run an in-place search first. I'll run the same one as before here. So let's say I have a search like this. So I found the 32 results. I actually don't have to preview that, but I just need to save my search here. And once the search is activated, if I explore drives now, then my drive exploration, let's say, will be in light of this limiting factor. So there's going to be a little indicator here telling us that there is an in-place search in effect, which is this. And then everything that we see here is essentially in light of that search, which is the 32 items that we found in the search. So we can focus on the results of the search and again, cherry pick from here, select everything or select a subset of the items. Now, I'll demonstrate the acquisition part very briefly, and we'll look at what metadata we can get from here. So I'll say explore drives. I will filter by something different. I want to look at the different MIME types, or essentially file types that are at play here. So I'll group by that, and then I can focus on this image file. That's the one image that we have in the collection. So let's say I want to acquire just this one thing. So I can select this, save my selection, OneDrive item to acquire. I can just say, yes, okay, go ahead. So we acquired. Pretty straightforward. The output side looks very similar to what you're used to from Google Drive probably. So we have the logs and we have the drive items. There's going to be a folder structure here, if that was a folder structure in the original. So here's our file that we acquired, and going back here, logs, we have the usual acquisition log, but this is the new log for direct OneDrive items, essentially downloaded direct OneDrive items. So let's walk through what we have here, because it's a little bit different than what we have been acquiring for other providers. We have the drive item ID, which is essentially the ID that we assign to it. Service ID for what the service provider uses to address this item. Output path is the path where we wrote this item, relative path. SHA-256 hash that we calculated for this item. MIME type, SHA-256 hash from OneDrive API for this item. So the Drive API reports this too for some item types. They have another type of hash called quick XOR hash, captured from OneDrive API, recorded here. These two are kind of interesting. So we are including these in case they will be helpful. I'll very briefly mention them just so they're on your radar. This is the entity tag and C tag here for content. So entity tag essentially covers the contents and the metadata of the file, whereas C tag covers just the contents. And I believe their main use case is for handling concurrency and change tracking. But in our context, what you could use it for is this. Let's say you acquired a certain file in the context of one acquisition, and then you reacquired the same file later on, maybe in a subsequent acquisition. If you wanted to see if the file's contents changed, then that would be fairly easy because you could look at the hash. But if you wanted to see if the file's OneDrive metadata changed, then entity tag can alert you to that. So if the two instances of the file have the same entity tag, then same contents and same metadata. Whereas if the entity tag changes, then that means that either contents or metadata has changed. So that could come in handy in some scenarios, or say edge cases, not all the time. But know that this is not about the binary contents of the file itself, in the sense that, let's say that we have a OneDrive, and in the OneDrive we have 5 instances of the same file by content. So I have the same, let's say, JPEG file, and I copied it 3 times in different folders into my OneDrive. Their hashes are going to be the same, but don't expect their E tag and C tag to be the same. They're just different instances, so they will be tracked differently. So there's a little bit of a distinction there. Moving on, file name, obvious. Folder path is the path that we captured for this item. So there's this creation and modification time for what OneDrive has. In this case, they're not very meaningful because these files are relatively new, planted down for this demonstration. File size is deleted, no, in this case. You'll see that for some data types, currently we're outputting JSON. And the reason for that is that the underlying data is fairly complex, and there's a lot of different aspects to it. For example, for created by, it's not only a person's email address or display name, but it could be device information and a lot of different data points. So for now, we didn't break that into a large number of individual metadata fields, but we might want to do that for some data points, as I'll show you in a little bit. So let's keep over created by and modified by, and move on to these two. So there's a different set of date time metadata here for files here, and this is the file system creation, modification, and access time. I wanted to mention this briefly as well, because you might think, hey, we had another set of creation and modification time earlier, so what's the difference here? And as far as I understand from OneDrive's and Graph API specification, this tracks the file system metadata from the client rather than the server, and that could differ from what the server has. For example, let's say that the end user created a file on their local system, and it's going to be synced to OneDrive, but they're not online right now. So they created it while they were offline, and they worked on the file, and then when they finished and when they became online, the file got synced. Now the time and date that OneDrive has about the file could reflect, when the sync operation happened and when the file actually got created in OneDrive, whereas the file system information that you see here should reflect when that local client had as file system metadata, which will be earlier. So there could be a significant difference in some cases in terms of file system metadata and OneDrive metadata, and there are two distinct things, and we capture them both and have them here. So in some cases you might see that they're the same, sometimes they might be different. Don't be surprised. know that there's a distinction there a little bit. We have location information where applicable. So this will be a good place to demonstrate for you why we captured this these complex data points as JSON for now. So let's say I have this, for example, and I want to take a look at my location information. So it will be something like this, right? I just predefined it a little bit. So you see that it contains a number of data points. It has the altitude, latitude, and longitude. If we wanted to play with this, we could, for example, take this and see if we can find this somewhere. So let me see if I can bring a browser window here. Let's go to Google Maps, search. It looks like it's pointing here. Let's see if I can drag the little guy over here. We're over there. If we turn our head, yeah, that looks about right. So that's probably the location where this picture was taken. So generally, you'll see that these data points will have essentially more than one thing in them. So another example of this is right next to this, we have photo info. So if I put that in here, you'll see that again, this is complex data point with the camera make and model, exposure, focal length, ISO, and the taken time. So although the Drive API metadata was just from a few days ago, the taken date time is from 2018. So that is essentially internal metadata to this file, and it's important to have it. You know, this could be the only real date that you have in some cases. Now, let me bring something to your attention here. And then there's one more thing here, that's the web URL. So let me show you that as well. So if we were logged in here as this user, let me bring another browser window here. So this will be the URL that's essentially gonna take you to that item. But if you're not logged in as that user, like we were earlier in another browser profile, let's see if that could, yeah, then that's going to require authentication. So don't think that this web URL is going to be like a free ticket to downloading or accessing that file. In most cases, when you perform an acquisition, you're probably going to find that that doesn't work without authentication. But that is the URL that you could use to access that file if you had the necessary authentication in place, let's say. So something I would like you guys to think about, or a couple of things to think about, is this. Number one, you see what we export in our logs right now. If you have worked with OneDrive /SharePoint before, or if you're familiar in general, and if you have some metadata points that you would like to have in our exports that would be helpful to you, let me know. This is essentially the first iteration of this, and we tried to pick, we're trying to be reasonable with how much data we acquire, because every piece of data you request is another step towards throttling and things slowing down. So it's not ideal, but at the same time, if there are some key elements you would like captured, we would like to accommodate. So let us know what is needed for your workflow. The second thing is, like I said, we have some of these compound data points that are currently JSON, and depending on your workflow, that may or may not be very immediately usable. But it would be possible, for example, to plug some of these things and make them individual fields. For example, for location, typically the latitude and longitude will be really useful. So we could pluck that out and make it a separate field just by itself, which would make it easier to run a search or identify or map things in bulk without having to write some scripts to parse the JSON, essentially. So again, let me know if anything like that is helpful, and if it is, then we'll think about getting that done. Now, a second type of thing that could happen is this. Sometimes you might have a scenario where, let me see here, you might have a list of identifiers from someplace else. So let's say that you had a few OneDrive IDs for files in OneDrive that you captured from something, a chat or Teams or some type of review database, emails. So how do we capture these specific files? For those of you who have been tracking FEC for a while, you probably already know the answer, but I want to walk through that real quick here too, because this is something that comes up a lot and I want everyone to be familiar with it. So for that, we can use very easily differential acquisitions. So I would just add to this a service ID column and save this on my drive here. Let's call it diff as a folder. I'll call this pcdev@outlook.com drive diff tsv. So the name of this is important. Don't think that you could name this anything. So it'll have to match the specific pattern. So once I have this, then I can create a new acquisition essentially. Let's get out of this one. And include OneDrive, of course. Skip over the case details, pick a folder and activate differential acquisition here. Choose my diff path, which is where I save my diff files. That could be the reason this is a path rather than a file, is that there could be multiple here. I covered this before when we first introduced differential acquisitions, but the general idea here is that you could have a folder full of hundreds or thousands of acquisitions, and you may want to make all your new acquisitions look at that specific folder. And because each FEC project and diff file has a specific naming pattern, the new acquisition would know which specific older FEC project or differential text file goes with this new acquisition essentially. So that's why the naming is important. But in this case, I want to limit so I don't want to exclude those 4 items that I had found in the wild, but I want to include them. So I want my new acquisition to be limited to just those items. So I'll choose this option to use as an inclusion list, which makes it essentially reverse. Normally a differential acquisition would exclude what has been previously acquired. In this case, we will include what is on this list. The rest is essentially the same. We're going to authenticate. No need for these system OneDrives. Acquire, we're going to find that we found 4 items out of the 144, and we're seeing 4 items acquired and 4 drive differential IDs were imported, so that adds up. And then when we look at our output here, we're going to have a folder structure, of course, documents, finance, templates, whatever. There's some folder structure there. So just remember this, like if you have a scenario where you're targeting specific items from OneDrive or SharePoint, then you could use this type of strategy to make a list of them and acquire just those specific items rather than perform a full-on acquisition. Now the next thing in mind is how this applies to Microsoft 365. And I said earlier that there are essentially 2 modes of this. One is I can authenticate as a user and access the OneDrives and SharePoint sites that are accessible to that user. And then I could authenticate as an app and then see everything in the organization if I like. So let's go through both of those. So authenticate as a user. So I'm not going to choose any of this impersonation or app-only auth options, but an important thing here, which could be a bit of a gotcha for now, remember that FEC defaults to EWS for email acquisition for now, and there are reasons for that. Mainly, let's just say that it's more feature complete for the time being. But this OneDrive and SharePoint acquisition is a Graph API thing. So if you are doing a Microsoft 365 acquisition, you're going to want to switch over to Graph API. And then here we have the usual options. You see that we have essentially one more option here for Microsoft 365, which is to use app-only auth. But in this case, I'll just target OneDrive and skip over these details. Pick a folder. Authenticate. And here the look is a little bit different. So earlier we were seeing a couple of OneDrives, but that was it. But in the context of Microsoft 365, now there are SharePoint files, sites. And you see that they have different icons. So OneDrives have this OneDrive icon, and SharePoint sites have this different SharePoint icon. So this is a list of the OneDrives that are essentially mine, and then the SharePoint sites, well, going down, the SharePoint sites that are accessible to my user. They might be sites that I created as a user, or they might be sites that I've been given access to. So if he sees digging that up and making you a list of SharePoint sites that this user can access, and then you can just choose whatever it is that you need. There are descriptions here where applicable, and acquire from all that. Similar concepts of exploring the drives and in-place search. Now there's a question about, do the exported files maintain metadata, specific dates, or do we need to reference the log for the metadata? Yeah, the very similar deal to essentially everything else that we do in emails and Google Drive. If there's API metadata in terms of creation timestamps and modification timestamps, then those will be reflected in the file system timestamps of the files that we export. And if we containerize them, they'll make their way into the container as well. So to answer Mark, no, you don't need to reference the logs or overlay that information. They're going to be set as the file system timestamps for those files. Now let's look at the third mode of operation here, which I would say is probably the most exciting, to authenticate as an app. Now we covered this, well, we didn't have a presentation about this, but we released this recently, and I'll show you the document for it that you can refer to, app-only authentication. So we have a pretty good document that covers how to set this up if you haven't done this before. Essentially a two-part process that involves an app registration in Microsoft Entra ID, and then once you have the app registered, you add the specific permissions needed for either Exchange Web Services or Graph API. Now for what we're doing right now, you would need this Graph API path, and in this case, in our document right now, we're adding the contacts, mail, and mailbox settings permissions, but we're going to update this soon when we release the new version of FEC, and we're going to add to that the drives read-only, and also, well, I think it's called files read-only, and also sites read-only. The sites cover essentially SharePoint sites, and the files cover OneDrive. So you're going to need two more permissions here. So we're going to update this and it'll be ready to go by the time we release the new version. But the idea here is this, if you haven't done this before, so when you set up app-only authentication, now you're not authenticating as a user anymore. You're authenticating as an app that has its own identity and own permissions based on whatever you define in your app registration and whatever you authorize as an admin one time. But to be clear, this doesn't, like FEC doesn't need admin permissions. Whoever is performing the authorization one time needs to be an admin, and then they authorize the app registration for the specific scopes that are needed, and then you're off to the races. So I have done that registration, and I have the app IDs that I need, so I'm going to show you how to plug them in to essentially do like an organizational level OneDrive and SharePoint acquisition. Again, I'll start with a user here. Little typo there. Switch over to Graph API. Include OneDrive. I don't need the emails for this demo. And now I'm checking app-only authentication. So it's going to ask me for some credentials. Let's go find them here. So you're going to need the client ID, client secret, and tenant ID. Skip over the other details. Now things are a little bit different. In this case, it doesn't really make a huge difference, but theoretically in a large organization, you could find hundreds or thousands of SharePoint sites here, because you're going to see not only this is this user's drives, but then under SharePoint sites, you're also going to see the OneDrives of other users in the organization. So you could not only acquire the SharePoint sites in this organization, but also OneDrives of just about anybody you want by targeting, specific user accounts and their OneDrives, and perform your in-place search and exploring of drives and all that stuff, and run your acquisitions. So this is a pretty powerful tool in the scope of access. Now, even at this stage, if you go to our output here, you'll see that we have captured, we haven't done any acquisition yet, and that will be a lengthy acquisition for our entire organization there. But you will see metadata for these SharePoint sites are and the OneDrives are captured here already. That includes coda information, creation times, URLs, who created them, and stuff like that. So we will probably look into this in more detail to see if there's anything else that we could capture here. And same thing as what I mentioned for file metadata. If you have any specific OneDrive or SharePoint site metadata that you would like in these logs, let us know. We got like the main data points that would be of interest, like I said, sizes, codas, creation times, and things of that nature. But overall, this last piece is, I think, the most exciting one, where you can essentially connect to the whole organization and collect SharePoint and OneDrive data. Now, I should add that we're not quite done, as you can imagine. If you recall from how we did Google Drive, that was a multi-phase operation, right? So in multiple phases we tackled it. Same thing here. So this I would call is probably phase one. Although I'm pretty excited about how far we have been able to come, because if you think about it, we got OneDrive and SharePoint tackled. We were able to plug in FEC's in-place search capability, differential acquisitions, and Drive Explorer into it. So the whole workflow is essentially there end to end. There's nothing missing there compared to what we do for Google Drive, which is very cool. I wasn't thinking we would come as far in the first iteration. So that's pretty much all there. But there are two big things that are yet to come. And I can imagine some of you are thinking about this right now. One of them is we will work on revisions, right? That's a big thing. So we do that in Google Drive, where we can get revisions of a file. Same type of deal here. We want to explore what we can do with OneDrive revisions of files. And another thing is going to be OneDrive attachments of emails, right? Same thing we do with Google Drive. When we acquire from Google, we're able to get Google Drive revisions of an email, Google Drive attachments of an email and their revisions. Similar deal, we want to get OneDrive attachments of an email and revisions of that where applicable. So don't think that we, those fell into the cracks. They haven't. They are in the works. It's just, a multi-phase process, and we want to get this out to you guys as soon as possible, because I know a lot of you have OneDrive acquisitions, and some of the things that FEC offers in terms of enterprise authentication, remote authentication, in-place search, containerization, all those things are really useful. So we would like to get this main part of the feature set out the door, and then in the subsequent phases we will tackle the other data points that are needed. One thing that you will probably notice is that I feel like the performance of OneDrive is quite a bit better than Google Drive, especially when it comes to docs and presentations and spreadsheets. For example, let me see if I can acquire a few hundred files just to show you how it goes, because in Google Drive things were a little bit slower, I feel, because Google Drive stores those native Google Docs and Google Sheets and Google Presentations as essentially database records, from what I can tell. And then when you request them, they essentially make a push to materialize that file, which is a computationally expensive process. Whereas in OneDrive, presumably those are already actual files. They have hashes, they have file sizes for them. So it makes things a little bit quicker. So if we were to do a few hundred files from here, let's see what kind of speed we're getting. So let's say I select the whole OneDrive here. That shouldn't be too much stuff here, so I'm not going to run a search or anything, but let's see if we can cycle if I have enough space there. cycle through. You see like the Excel spreadsheets and Word documents are flying around. Some of them are not that small and they're zipping through pretty fast. So the acquisition process here is quite a bit different than Google Drive. I would say Google Drive would have taken a little longer. So that is kind of encouraging to me, especially in terms of email attachments. Well, also for direct acquisitions like this too, it makes it a lot more feasible to do large-scale acquisitions and not really be stuck in retries and throttling and stuff like that. You're able to just zip through them relatively quickly. Anyway, no need to wait for this. Just want to show you what the speed of this looks like. It's not lightning fast because the files are still somewhat sizable, but compared to Google Drive, I feel like the speed is pretty good. All right, so this is what we have for you so far. I hope it is somewhat exciting to you guys too, as it is for me, and I hope it'll be useful. Like I said, this is pretty much wrapped up right now and in testing. There might be little tweaks and polishing that we may need to do before we release it, but it's coming pretty fast. I would say probably a matter of a week or two before we release it at the most. And then once you get to play with it, or even now that you've seen some of it, let us know, what's missing for you, what would make your life easier. A request is coming from one of the viewers here perhaps it's useful to display the size of the drive in the user interface when we explore. That is a good idea, and we do get that information from the API as a data point that we put in the acquisition log. So I'll take a look at that. I would want to make sure that that is pretty accurate information, because I don't want that to be misleading. And there were a couple of instances where the sizes were, I felt like they were not quite right coming from the API, but I'll take another look at that. If it is immediately usable information, I think I agree. That's a good idea to essentially put a little parenthetical information there telling you how big of a drive that is, so you know what you're getting into before you target that. So thank you for that. If that's feasible, we'll plug that into this current build probably before we release it. So it's good to get some live feedback before we even publish the software. All right, well, if you guys have any questions before we close, you can drop them in the chat wherever you're watching this. If not, you know where to find me. Like I said, expect that this will drop probably in a week or two. And then once you play with it, I would appreciate some feedback on how things are working, what else is needed, and how we can improve, as always. Thank you so much for taking the time to join. Enjoy the rest of your day.